Welcome to the session this morning. We're optimistically titling this How to Design Successful Micromobility Schemes. We've got an hour and a half and we've got some eminent speakers. Mark, are we going to flick onto the Slido slide? So during the presentation today, we'll be using Slido. So if you want to scan that code, that would be fantastic. That'll come up in the Serco presentation later on. Just give that a moment for you to look at that. We'll have that. You'll be able to scan that later in the presentation too, but it might be helpful to do that right now if you can. Okay, I can hear plenty of people dropping in, so I'm going to give it one moment. But we've got lots to cover today, so let's kick off. So my name's Matt Winfield. I'm the Exec Director at Sustrans for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, so our operational delivery across those nations. And micromobility is an increasing and exciting kind of thing for us. I don't think there's yet a definition of micromobility that's accepted across the industry, but at Sustrans, we're thinking about small vehicles that move people and goods, typically scooters, cycles, e-bikes, e-scooters, and coming in many forms, human-powered and powered by electricity. And I think typically the size of the vehicle at Sustrans is a thing that we think defines micromobility probably most clearly, and we would suggest maybe below 500 kilograms, but then you get into an issue about small cars too. But what we do know is it's controversial, like a lot of things in this space, and I'm sure you've had conversations outside of the professional space where people have very trenchant views about micromobility. So we've got some eminent speakers for you, and then we're going to go to a Q&A session, and we're going to leave quite a lot of time for that. We've already had quite a lot of questions from people attending. There's a real interest in this. So we're going to hear from Shafaq first from DFT, and then Antonia from CoMoUK, and then a joint presentation from Liberatus and Sam from Serco, and then we're going to go into a panel discussion. So please do use the Q&A button at the top of your screens to put in questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. But I think we'll get started, lots to get through. So I'm going to pass over to Shafaq from DFT.
Morning, everyone. Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Shafaq Malik from the Department for Transport. I'm a senior policy advisor on our sort of micromobility policy team, and I'm currently leading on developing what we're hoping to develop into a sort of shared mobility, micromobility framework for authorities and operators to use to be able to sort of operate these schemes going forward. So if we go to the first slide, thank you. So I think start off on a positive note. I think it's really important and it's definitely important for us when we do our thinking, is to make sure that we are viewing the mode and viewing micromobility from the lens of the opportunities of the mode. And really our role, as we see it at the minute, is just to strengthen the legal standing of these schemes so that they can be confidently factored into our transport networks. Currently, I think outside of sort of the requirement that was stood up when we introduced the e-scooter trials, outside of that, there is a lack of a legal requirement to seek permission to operate these schemes, and that's posed a risk. And we've seen, we have seen some examples where it's posed a risk to authorities of rogue operators, depositing unchecked vehicles onto transport networks. And that makes it difficult for authorities, and it makes it difficult for responsible operators as well. Other opportunities, we're hoping that a sort of a shared common framework will facilitate regulation so that street clutter can be planned around and reduced to ensure that public spaces remain safe, inclusive of individual needs, and also just conducive to active travel offerings across the board. Risks that we're sort of mindful of are, we know that there are several sort of successful existing share schemes, bike share schemes. We don't want to unduly burden those or impact them. So that's something we're thinking about. And also just that We think that local authorities are best placed to operate these schemes, but that also means making sure that we are mindful of the sort of complexities of governance structures when it comes to local devolution. If I go to the next slide. So current situation, as I mentioned, there's a sort of a lack of a formal legal requirement. So I suppose you could consider it a bit of a free market. What that means is that these share schemes, in terms of their sort of enforceability, they operate on, I think some of them, a lot of them operate on a, oh, I think we've got a point here about not being able to see slides, but I'll let Mark take care of that. I was going to say, so, you know, there are sort of contracts of varying natures that sort of regulate these schemes. I think there have been some cases where schemes have been set up on the basis of a memorandum of understanding, which can be, I mean, I think from a department point of view, you know, we think can leave all parties really vulnerable because, you know, their enforceability can be called into question. I think really where we want to end up, though, is sort of somewhere between like taking the best of a licensing system that would require sort of operators to hold a license to operate these schemes. They'd apply to the authority to get a license, and, you know, and then they'd be able to sort of legally operate those schemes, but also combine it with the best and the sort of the benefits of the procurement system as well. So, and that's what we're thinking about right now. That's the sort of direction that we're taking at the minute. If I go on to the next slide, conscious I, you know, don't want to take up too much time. $1 million question. When parliamentary time allows, we will establish, we hope to sort of legally establish this framework. We are intending to consult on some of the details later on in the year. Although I think exact timings for that are not confirmed so far. But when parliamentary time does allow, you can see we'll be sort of essentially laying in Parliament the primary legislation, which will essentially just put down the sort of the high levels of the framework. And then some of the sort of finer details of what a framework might include will probably go in secondary. And I think what we're really hoping is that we can have some support from government there'll be some like a portion of minimum standard conditions that will be common to all schemes, and that the large majority of the conditions are actually something that local authorities and operators can come to an agreement between themselves, based on sort of local transport interests, priorities, ambitions. So yeah, so that's what we're thinking, and we're just, I think, just to sort of sum up, I think, you know, local authorities are best placed to decide what works for them. I think DFT's role is just sort of imparting some sort of consistency to the landscape to try and sort of bolster the future of the mode and give security to operators and confidence to authorities, so that ultimately we can sort of widen the nationwide offering of these like micromobility schemes. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Excuse me. So key message there about regulation and governance, and that local authorities can decide what works best for them. We've got over 400 people, I think, in the room today, and a great chunk of those from local authorities. So it'd be really interesting to get comments and questions from local authority colleagues as we go through. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Antonia from CoMo. Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me today. Great to see so many people here engaging in this topic, and great to hear from the DFT that they are committing to getting that legislation through, which is going to be so vital for this area. So yeah, I'm Antonia Roberts, Deputy Chief Exec, CoMoUK. As you'll see on the next slide, I have been with CoMo for over 20 years, and we are a charity that helps to support the development of all aspects of shared transport, car clubs, bike share, e-scooters, etc. And we do that by bringing together public and private sector to kind of address the nitty-gritty around these issues. Developing shared schemes is not easy, which is why we exist and why we have sessions like this today. But by creating guidance, looking into the research and understanding the impacts of the different modes and bringing people together to kind of debate the issues as they emerge, it's a very fast moving area. We can help to learn and make sure we have success going forward. So starting with bike share, I've just got a map on the next slide which shows where we are with bike share at the moment. So plenty of dots on there. I don't imagine you can read them all, but there's around 40 schemes at the moment. New ones emerging all the time. Nottingham Derby launched recently. We'll have Leeds on there again later in the year. There has obviously been some schemes that have disappeared over time. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important that we have sessions like this today, because there's lots of schemes that are flourishing and doing really well, but without getting the ingredients right, it's very easy for schemes to struggle as well. Going on to a map of scooter schemes in the UK at the moment. Now, this is obviously subject to where there are trials. So all of the scooters that are out there at the moment are part of the government trials, and which have all been extended through to next year, and eagerly awaiting legislation to be able to expand it further, particularly into Scotland and other areas that haven't been able to have trials so far. Really healthy number, I think, and it's going to be great that there's so much there that we can learn from, of all different scales and sizes. It will be interesting to see, I think, how many of these continue in their current form once we get past this kind of initial phase, which is kind of like a showcase for scooters in the country at the moment. So moving on to thinking about the benefits of the different micromobility modes. So starting with bike share again, this is some kind of sneak preview of our annual research that's about to come out next week. We've done this for 7 years now, I think, and it's got fairly consistent results across the number of years. I think Juliana might post our last year's results in there so you can have a look at those. These are two of my favourite stats that I like to kind of share particularly. One, which shows how bike share is a real gateway drug into cycling. It really encourages people to come back into cycling that have lapsed or perhaps haven't ever cycled before, because it takes away many of the barriers. It makes it very easy to kind of just have a go, not have to think about the cost and the maintenance, and just gives you an opportunity to try it out. And also, I'm always surprised each year as to how many trips people would say they otherwise would have done by car. I think there's inevitably, that sounds negative, but there's a majority of shift from walking and public transport, because bike sharing provides people with the opportunity to have a healthier or faster trip, or have the choice to be able to use a bike for those kind of trips. But many people are switching from car, and therefore there's a really significant impact there, potentially for carbon savings, congestion, and we see that particularly an uplift in that with e-bikes, which are increasing in the fleets as we go forward. Okay, so just a couple of thoughts now about the benefits of e-scooters. This is a couple of stats that have come out from the DFT evaluations that they did across the trials so far. Which again, looking at the modal shift from car, if you see the purple line there is around 20% of trips that would otherwise have been done by car or taxi. So again, another really high potential for reduction in air quality issues, carbon, and so forth. And I think there was perhaps criticism of scooters that they were only being used for leisure rides, and we saw more of that at the beginning. But as the trials have gone on, the shift has really moved towards scooters being used for commuting, for utility trips, and really important functional trips, as well as the leisure. Okay, so what I wanted to concentrate on now is kind of 4 main areas that I think are important for getting micromobility schemes working really well. And so I'm going to combine the issues around bike sharing and scooter sharing. There's a lot of common elements to them, some slight differences, which I'll point out as we go through. So first of all, it's just really important that the scheme is designed really well and fits to the local area. So thinking about what are the policy issues, what are the challenges for that area, what's the geography of that area, how do the trip generators affect what's needed, and to fit all those together. So you might design a scheme so that it's feeding in people as a first mile or last mile into public transport, or you might have an area where you've got congested public transport route that you're actually trying to help to provide an alternative to. You might have some employment sites that you're trying to link people to, or tourism attractions. There might be an emphasis on health and improving active travel, or indeed there might be an issue around transport poverty and improving options for people, particularly travelling for things like shift work. So all of those affect how you design the scheme and making sure it fits the local area. I think it's worth noting as well that not all bike share needs to be on-street self-service. We've been working with a few market towns and smaller rural areas recently, where it's maybe more appropriate to have a back-to-base hire scheme, or perhaps longer term loans to give people access to bikes, which is just more appropriate for that kind of setting. And that might also work well where you're looking to include adapted bikes as well, to have a kind of more of a model where it's managed by people rather than self-service. So at the other end of this scale, on the largest kind of conurbations, there is the question of whether to have multiple operators or not. We don't really see this outside of London at the moment, only one or two places, and it does make it more challenging for the economics and the financial viability of schemes. So it's one to be very cautious about and to think carefully. Also thinking about the different types of modes that you want in there. So in terms of bike share at the moment, it's roughly split a third into 3/3 of ones that are pedal bike only, pedal and electric only. There's definitely an increase in electric only schemes. I think electric helps to widen participation. It helps with longer distance journeys. If you've got suburbs that you want to link people through from, scooters attracts a slightly different demographic again, and it's really good for the shorter trips. And increasingly, we're seeing some e-cargo bikes brought into schemes now, London, and there was a trial in Manchester as well. So asking people about whether there's interest there as well will be really important. Okay, so the second point that I had in terms of scheme success is very much linked, which is developing the economics and the kind of framework around developing schemes. So first of all, my point would be, please do engage with the market. There are lots of broad issues which are common across all schemes, but there's lots that are very specific to each area. And there's lots of changes that are happening in the market as well. So actually having those market engagement days really helps to set out a successful scheme right from the start. Funding is the big question. Outside of London, most bike share will need some form of capital funding and potentially some form of revenue funding. This is slightly different for scooters, and it's also slightly different where the schemes are combined. And funding doesn't necessarily always need to mean grant funding from government. It can be through sponsorship, advertising, Section 106 agreements, different ways in which you can actually help to kind of improve the profitability of schemes through the design, or reduce the cost of the scheme through the design. There's different ways of looking at that whole economic package, but certainly bringing scooters and bikes together helps with the economics. It doesn't always mean that you can then make a scheme revenue neutral. It really will depend on the area, but they work well together, particularly where it's the same operator. Bringing in more than one operator competing with the different modes can be a challenge. It is happening at the moment, but I think it's something that might put extra pressure on the finances there. I know that Serco will go on to talk about schemes in which the local authority owns the actual scheme, and it's seen as part of public transport because they've got examples of that in their portfolio. At the other end of the spectrum, we have schemes which are owned and run at the risk of the operators themselves, and this very much leads you how to do how the procurement process needs to be led. There is a bit of a history in the past of procurement exercises where the risk and ownership has been on the operator, but there's still been very onerous specifications and contracts coming through the procurement process. So it needs to be much more light touch specification design when you're thinking about putting all of that risk, so that the scheme can be nimble. But where there is funding to run it as a service, obviously therefore there'll be a very much tighter specification. Okay, so my third area that I wanted to speak about, which is just kind of getting that density out there. Density equals convenience, which equals increased ridership, no doubt about it. You know, people don't want to walk very far. You want to think about this in a similar way to a bus network. You know, people want to be able to access and drop off the vehicles really easily. Definitely a huge shift towards designated bays in the market. There are a few schemes out there now that have free floating operations. Free floating does maximise convenience, but we all know about the controversy around, you know, obstructions on the pavements and bad parking and so forth. So designated bays really helps to manage that. But if you're going to go down that route, then you need a really good mix of bays. Larger bays at high trip generating locations, and then infilled with lots of mini bays to give that convenience. And in order to do this, really, we need to be taking more space from car parking, more on-street carriageway. And there's a really promising shift towards this now. We're seeing a lot of local authorities tackling this. And obviously it's quite controversial in terms of potential loss of parking income, which is why you need politicians to help to kind of put the case and see the bigger picture here. Ideally, all of this is brought together in mobility hubs. This is a whole different spectrum of work that we've got lots of guidance on if you're interested, but it's about kind of creating highly visible, well-designed, convenient, comfortable spaces, which means using sustainable modes is much more attractive than using the private car. And yeah, we're seeing some really interesting work in that area too. So my fourth and final kind of area, which I think is really important for successful schemes, is creating that whole supportive ecosystem around this. So schemes will flourish when they're part of what's seen as the public transport network and are treated as something that needs to be nurtured through all of the policies around that. So we want areas which make it friendly and nice to be able to use a bike and a scooter, and the right infrastructure to be able to support that. At the same time, we want policies that help to disincentivize people from bringing the private car into those spaces, and a shift towards giving higher priority to sustainable modes. And I think the support for bike and scooter share needs to be integrated through all of the policies, which will help to kind of make sure that funding comes through and the infrastructure changes that are needed come through repeatedly as the scheme develops, and it keeps shifting that ecosystem to being more and more supportive. The vehicles themselves work really well as kind of little roving adverts across, so awareness is usually very high of the schemes, but actually still take-up can sometimes be hindered by people not being confident. So schemes where you work on providing training for people, helping to kind of talk people through, you know, one-to-one sessions can often be really helpful. And so in working with community groups and, you know, the bodies that are working in this area can be really helpful to try and help to address some of these barriers. And I know that some of the operators are working on providing addressing barriers to, you know, people on low incomes, people job seekers and so forth, to kind of take up the schemes. And I think all of those things are really important, but they all cost money, they all take officer time, and so it really is kind of a joint effort on the point of the council and the operator to make sure that this all works well. So just on my final slide, I will do a quick plug for various reports that we've got coming out. In the next day or so, hot off the press will be our review of the scooter trials in England. We've got, as I mentioned, our latest bike share report coming out next week, and I think Juliana's already posted our bike share guidance, which kind of talks through a lot of these issues, which I hope will be useful. My contact details are there if you want to keep in touch and yeah, hear more about what we do. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a load of ground covered there. Really, really interesting. I'm sure provokes a lot of thoughts and questions. I think you talked there about scale, how this applies at different kind of urban settings. Really interesting. And the parking issue, which we know all the feedback, there's a lot to be said about that. I think that was a big reason why people in Paris voted 90% to remove their hire recently, even though 8% of Parisians voted, which is clearly quite a small number. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So just to remind you about the Q&A, the Q&A button is in the top there in the middle. And if you could look at the questions people are asking and click the thumb if you want to vote that up, and we'll make sure we get to the questions that are attracting the most interest. That'd be great. Next speakers are Liberatus and Sam from Serco. Pass over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Matt, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. So firstly, I'm Sam Jones. I'm Micromobility Director at Serco, and I'm joined by my colleague, Liberatus, this morning. We're going to spend about 20 minutes or so just going through some of our thoughts around how we may be able to support the delivery of micromobility services and ensure they are successful. Micromobility is still, I guess, quite nascent in its journey, and there are a couple of areas that we think, from our experience over the last couple of years, where there can be things that are put in place early on in the process that can enhance the prospects of schemes becoming successful, particularly in the design area. If you just go to the next slide, Matt. We're really coming at this. I mean, Serco is a global provider of public services to government primarily. So we're not typical of a micromobility company or a brand. We're an operator primarily. So we're really coming at this from the services angle, and we're interested in how we can start to deliver micromobility services that are integrated into the broader transport network, that are delivered over a long-term period, and ultimately that contribute to the primary objectives of these schemes, which is cleaner air, better and fairer transport, and healthier options for transport as well. So that's really the angle that we're coming at this. If we just go to the next slide. For those that don't know, before micromobility was a term, we were probably one of the first operators, if not the first operators, of bike share in the UK, and we obviously still are linked to the London Cycle Hire scheme today. We designed, built and operated that scheme from 2010, and we're really proud of some of the achievements of that scheme over the last 12 years. We've also operated schemes in Edinburgh, and most recently launched the West Midlands cycle hire scheme as well, and have experience of operating in both commercial environments. So as Antonia mentioned, in the services model, and also in the concession model as well, and Liberatus will come on to discuss that. Before I just pass you over to Liberatus, I think we've got a quick poll to get to know you all. So if you're able to respond to the Slido, and we'll just see where you are in your micromobility journey. Okay, so looking like a reasonable spread. There's a 31% of people we can try and convert over the next 20 minutes.
No pressure then.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, it looks like the stats there are sort of evening out. So I mean, obviously we've got the scheme in place, performing well. There's a good proportion in the early stages of wanting a scheme, so there'll be some information later on in the pack that's particularly pertinent there. Equally, 12% in the fact-finding stages. So yeah, a fairly good spread, and I can see we've had about 120 respondents, so good proportion of you have responded to that, so thank you. In the interest of time, I suggest we move on now. So, Liberatus, you want to pick up?
For sure. So we would love to take the opportunity to highlight the importance of planning for commercial viability when making a micromobility scheme. This can ensure that micromobility services become a long-term fixture in communities and an established part of the local transport offering. The 3 pillars of commercial viability are funding, the business models, and the tariff structure. So the first part of this presentation will introduce each of these key factors and explain how choices made by local authorities shape the success of the micromobility service delivered. So if we just move on to the next slide. So as touched on by Antonia, micromobility has a higher proportion, the funding landscape is quite important. Micromobility has a higher proportion of fare box recovery in comparison to traditional transit. However, there is still a funding delta that is needed to cover the full cost of delivery. So additional funding is especially important in years 1 and 2. This is as the adoption of the new service grows and operational maturity is reached. More recently in the UK, capital funding from the central government has come in the form of Transforming Cities Funds, Future Mobility Zones and Towns funding. Sponsorships are also a very important part. So Barcelona's Bicing scheme was able to sell their rights to Vodafone for 1.2 million euros a year. It's worth highlighting that sponsorship can be dependent on the economic climate and private sector's priorities. So it's really best to engage early in the process to ensure that the sponsor agreement is aligned with the scheme launch. We would encourage authorities to explore both national and local sponsors, and also the potential to provide strategic sponsorship, so in-kind benefits, for example, the provision of redistribution vehicles, which can be used by the scheme. Grant funding. Now, this is one which tends to be a little bit more broad in its remit, so maybe focus on generally transport or decarbonisation, and then authorities are able to submit particular applications on behalf of micromobility. Examples of this include the Energy Saving Trust, who funded e-bike purchases for Glasgow's Cycle Hire scheme, or the Surface Transportation Block Grant Fund, which is one that exists in America and Colorado and other states have been able to draw down upon. Section 106 funding and community infrastructure levies. So this is something that we're currently working on in the West Midlands. This requires new developments to make an investment in community infrastructure, for example, docking stations. We believe that this supports the reduction of car dependency by building in sustainable transport options directly during the placemaking process. And we would encourage authorities to explore options to either support asset purchases, so as we said, docking stations and vehicles, or potentially even scheme access, so membership purchases for people who will be coming to these new developments. Lastly, we have things such as the workplace parking levy and clean air zones. So we see this as an opportunity to use funds that are collected from activities that produce negative externalities and reinvest them directly into transport improvements. So again, an opportunity to create modal shift. Examples of this include the revenue for the operation of Barcelona's Bicing bike share scheme come from on-street parking fees, or in Medellin, where the Encicla scheme is funded for environmental taxation and actually provides free rides to users. As touched on by Antonia, depending on the funding streams available, authorities have a different range of business models at their disposal to deliver micromobility. Each have different benefits and considerations. So we'll move on to the next slide and we can address that. So in a managed service, authorities will contract out the delivery of micromobility schemes to a private operator, but still remain the administrator. There, they have the opportunity to integrate micromobility into the wider transport strategy. Operators will bring their experience and best practice from other markets, and there is an opportunity to align their incentives contractually. This can be via profit share and risk share mechanisms. Operators are contractually bound to deliver the service for the duration of the agreement and are not exiting easily. This ensures service provision for the local population for the duration of that contract. Conversely, concessions provide the right for an operator, only a right for the operator to deploy, and this is usually at a cost, so either a per vehicle fee or a flat fee. However, this does create a financial pressure for the operator to break even from day zero. And also the operator will be taking on revenue risk, so they may demand for more discretion over tariffs or scheme coverage areas, and may also push back on service level requirements. Operators will take all the benefit from the scheme's success, so it is less akin to public transport. They do bring innovations from their research and development, but crucially, there is no IP transfer to the authority. There are actually, unfortunately, quite limited examples of long-standing concessions. So to touch on Shafaq's point at the beginning of the presentation, most of these are organized via MOUs, and meaning that operators are able to exit markets. And this does have an impact on service continuity, as the authority does not own the assets, and if they choose to exit, the local population may be left without micromobility provision. Lastly, authorities may choose to deliver schemes in-house. However, it's worth highlighting that this has a significant resource requirement, and there is quite a specialized skill set required to deliver micromobility just because it's a nascent mode of transport. We do want to highlight that as there are more electric vehicles coming into the micromobility mix, so e-scooters and e-bikes, there is a possibility of blended solutions. However, this requires that there is a good balance of risk and reward for both parties. We don't believe there's only one correct method, but it is worth considering the different trade-offs that need to be made. If we just move on to tariff design. So regardless of the model selected, tariffs will form a contribution to the financing of the scheme's operational costs. The data that we have here on screen was taken from the North American Bike Share Association survey. We chose this data set because there are over 298 cities with a micromobility scheme, so it provides a wide overview across different city sizes. Actual proportions will most definitely vary by city, and in some instances, actually, the proportion of farebox recovery is much higher. For example, in Washington, DC, where over 50% is funded by user revenues. Tariffs can be structured by operators and authorities to support both their commercial and social objectives, and can also be targeted at different user personas. So here we'll take a quick look at some popular tariff structures that exist in micromobility. First of all, pay per minute with an upfront unlock fee. This usually will encourage casual and incidental usership, and also allows for uptake by one-time visitors to a city, for example, tourists, which in peak season can actually provide a significant funding contribution. Next up, we have membership models. So these can all be organized either monthly or annually, and this will create a dedicated user base who will use the scheme as part of their regular travel patterns. There is also an opportunity to create affinity with either the scheme or the transport authority because there are additional touch points with the provider, for example, through the provision of membership keys or members-only benefits. Lastly, subscription models. These are a more nascent form of tariff, which are more akin to payment methods for other types of services, such as phone contracts or media, and they actually could appeal to a younger audience, and they are aligned to the consumption of the service. For example, in the West Midlands, we have a minute bundle where people are drawing down from a balance of minutes as and when they use the scheme. Getting the tariff right is important to ensure the longevity of a scheme. It needs to be attractive enough to attract and retain riders, whilst also being at a level that it contributes to the scheme's sustainability. Serco are able to offer partners some qualitative and quantitative market research in order to inform pricing strategy. And we take into account other local transport offerings and how we can appeal to these different user personas. So I'd be happy to follow up with any interested authorities after. If we just move on to the next slide. So this focus on commercial viability highlights what we call the micromobility trilemma. So these are the trade-offs that authorities are forced to make when considering scheme design. So equitable access from a geographical perspective, affordable tariffs, and the cost to the authority. Each local area and authority is unique, and so will the optimal scheme design. Taking into account the business models that we've touched on earlier, it's important that authorities consider that the subsidy or funding provided is proportionate to the demands and risks that are placed on the operators. Where local authorities wish to have a high degree of control over the scheme on elements such as pricing, equitable distribution, making it akin to public transport, there may be higher levels of funding which are required. Conversely, if there is less public funding or subsidy available, operators will wish to have more control over the scheme as they need to manage their operating costs and maximize their revenue. This can manifest itself through a reduced coverage area, which may focus exclusively on the city centre, and higher tariffs, because unfortunately not every area or user base is necessarily profitable. As Sam will touch on later, we recommend that the authority consider the relationship between these parameters when they're structuring the procurement process. This is especially important when trying to strike the balance between the quality and the price criteria in scoring. The trilemma is especially poignant at a scheme outset. As a scheme reaches maturity, it can actually reach a position of revenue surplus. In modern micromobility schemes, there is definitely the growth of electric assets, as touched on by Antonia. This means that there may be a higher upfront cost for the purchase of the e-bikes and the e-scooters, and even the charging infrastructure if they're going to be docked in a charging bay. However, it's worth noting that these schemes have also tend to experience higher levels of usage, and therefore can be more revenue generative and actually contribute to the scheme finances more significantly. With this in mind, let's turn to how scheme design can be aligned to the authority's objectives in practice. So authorities are recommended to seek a bespoke solution that helps them to meet their objectives. They should try to tailor their hardware, software, and scheme design to the outcomes they wish to see. During the scheme design process, it's imperative that the authority defines their objectives for micromobility. and should be asking themselves some of the following questions. What are the priorities that they're trying to achieve? Is it a reduction in the road network and congestion, which has an impact on air quality and travel times? The provision of affordable and sustainable transport in low-income areas, which can contribute to modal shift? Or is it maximizing the usage of the cycling infrastructure investments which they've made? They should also be considering how it will interact with the current transport networks. Are they seeking to have micromobility as a connection point, leading to an increase in multimodal journeys, or are they seeking to fill in gaps in the existing transport offering? Lastly, as Antonia mentioned, the different types of hardware. So pedal bikes, e-bikes, and scooters are the most popular, but there are also adjacent offerings that are coming online. So cargo bikes, adapted cycles, and also the potential of long-term rental schemes. We believe that the launch of a micromobility scheme and the design, there is an opportunity to align this to the local transport plan of the authority. For example, in the West Midlands, they wanted sustainable mobility provision across all 7 authorities. So as we can see on screen, we have been able to facilitate both trips within particular region authorities, but also across the region. We'll take a deeper look at it now in the next slide. So we would like to touch on Serco's network design toolkit. So this is how we use a range of demand analysis techniques and bespoke modeling tools to find the right fit for different geographies. It's very important to understand the density required for a successful scheme because this is critical to its adoption. One of the crucial outcomes is ensuring that users are able to find a vehicle when they want to start a journey and have a place to end a trip. So when we're considering new schemes, we look at some prescriptive and predictive analysis. The factors that we look at when we're modeling are the percentage of 18 to 40-year-olds. This is because this is the most popular age band for micromobility and captures some key demographics, including students. The percentage of car ownership in the local area, which we can use as a proxy for car dependency. The distance to rail stations and green space. The distance to the nearest cycle lanes, and also the topography, which may suggest that electric assets could be favored. When planning networks, it's crucial to think about the different types of journeys that authorities are trying to enable. For example, commuter journeys are likely to be A to B, with a different starting point to end point. There are also leisure journeys which occur around major attractions, for example, green spaces, and those may be A to A, with users returning the assets to its original start point. For this reason, overall networks are best envisaged as clusters, which we can see on screen. So these are defined around the defined geographical area, and we work to facilitate trips amongst the different points in the cluster. Areas can be broadly defined by a key feature or purpose. So for example, a place of employment or education, retail destinations, or leisure destinations. It's also important to consider the route between the clusters, as users will often be performing different activities throughout the day, and we need that the network is aligned to the user's needs. Thinking of schemes in clusters also allows for a phased implementation and allows for schemes to adapt itself to user demand patterns that will establish themselves post-mobilization. And here there is an opportunity to do retroactive analysis. So for example, in our West Midlands scheme, when we were planning to do some dock moves and moving some existing docks into new locations, we chose the new locations on the basis of where users were currently ending their trips outside of the current bays. So I'll now pass over to Sam, who will talk a little bit more in depth about the mobilization process and how that contributes further to the successful outcomes that we try to achieve here.
Thank you, Liberatus. Yeah, so we've got a slide here that just summarises the 5 stages of a micromobility system as we see them. Now, Antonia and Liberatus have covered really well sort of the planning and inception stage, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there. I'll pick it up at just a few key points to consider from mobilisation onwards. The one element I will just mention around the planning stage, so those decisions around exclusivity, network, vehicle type, identification of funding, and identification of ongoing funding, whether that is ongoing capital funding for future growth or support for accessible objectives. The more that is progressed in that inception and planning stage, the better the prospects are for the delivery of the ultimate scheme, and generally the easier the procurement is as well. It is not impossible or unheard of for some of those decisions to be moved into subsequent stages. So an authority may put network and planning and defer that to a procurement or a mobilisation phase and for instance the operator then will need to navigate through the planning process. But where those decisions are made, that can be done, but that can then increase the mobilisation timeframe. So the more that can be done early on in the scheme, and it's irrespective of model, whether it's operator risk or managed service or some sort of blend, irrespective of that, the more that can be worked through in the planning stage, the better the prospects are for a faster mobilisation. Depending on the levels of activity within mobilisations and what is included in the procurement, we think from going from inception to assets on street can take in the region of 12 to 24 months. Mobilisations typically, the award has happened, it's public, so often there is pressure from political pressure, authority pressure, public pressure to ensure that the commitments made in the procurement process are met. So as an operator, there's then multiple activities that must take place in parallel. So identifying the supply chain and delivery of assets, network and design, and that is highlighted because that is critical if that isn't understood well. Obviously bringing staff in and finding the right locations, etc. So that those activities all must take place in parallel, and they can range anywhere from just mobilisation alone 6 months to 12 months, and we've got some case studies later on of how we've delivered those in multiple activities in parallel. But at the risk of repeating myself, the more that can be identified in the planning and procurement stage, the smoother mobilisation can go. The final point I'll call out, which is an area that we think often isn't addressed in micromobility, and that is around the operational review and then scheme growth. So the intention of these schemes is that they will become a part of the transport mix, and they should be measured by how many users they can acquire over the term of the contract, and the aim should be to grow users on the system to increase that usage over time and fundamentally achieve modal shift. In order to achieve this, the early phases of a scheme is often critical, and sometimes we've seen where because funding is limited, that a lot of the focus goes into getting the scheme up and operational, and there's less thought into how it can be grown. Early on in the scheme is often when it can be quite popular and there is an energy around the scheme and users start to use it, and that is a really good time to double down on where the scheme is popular. That could be by increasing the type of assets that are popular. So if you mobilise with a mix of assets and one is particularly popular, so e-scooters or e-bikes, doubling down, increasing the volume of assets, or equally expanding the scheme early on in its development to ensure that the scheme continues to attract more and more users. And in order to do that, again, irrespective of model, understanding not just in year one where the funding will be to set the scheme up, but what opportunities there are throughout the contract to add assets to the scheme to continue that user acquisition and ultimately community adoption of the scheme, which will be critical to its success. I'll just quickly move on to case studies, and then we'll go to the panel. So I wanted to include just an example of the London Cycle Hire scheme. Now, the principles of how the scheme was delivered apply to whether it's a 100 bike scheme or a 12,000 bike scheme in this case. So those of you that are observing and think, well, we're not London, so we're not going to procure a scheme of that scale. I think these points still stand true, whatever the size. So it launched in 2010, and obviously was a popular service from the outset. Funding was identified early on by the authority, and that popularity was exploited through further expansions quite quickly. So the scheme doubled in size over the first 2 years, enabling it to continue that user acquisition. The contracting term was a period of around 10 years, which enabled the operator to obviously learn about the system and enhance it. And there were mechanisms within the contract to upgrade the system. Technology is moving very quickly in this industry, and the launch of new products. The launch of new products is another important factor into ensuring a scheme stays relevant and continues to attract new users. So as the technology moved on, so did the system, and we integrated new technologies such as the first mobile app, into bringing in smart bikes and subsequently bringing in e-bikes. The final principle I'll just talk through is around infrastructure. So the scheme has been the scheme over the last couple of years has continued to grow in popularity, and that is alongside a substantial investment by the boroughs and TfL into the cycling infrastructure. So around 200 kilometres of cycle lanes installed within the last 24 months just in London. Applying that to other cities, it simply means a micromobility service should be delivered in tandem with infrastructure improvements if they are required, and in most UK cities they probably are required. So if you're launching a scheme in your area but you don't have sight of where the infrastructure is going to be installed, or there aren't any plans to improve infrastructure, I think that's a serious consideration that needs to be had with respect to influencing the authority to improve overall transport networks for active travel users. And then what we can see from there is when those principles come together, you see a scheme that continues to grow in popularity and achieving year on year higher growth. I can see Matt on the screen, which means we're tight for time. So I'll finish on this next slide. If you just go to that, the final example I'll just draw upon. This is a really good example of the points that Antonia drew out around objectives. So in the West Midlands cycle hire scheme, the objectives of that system were really well defined within the procurement. There was a real accessibility focus. So the scheme had to be present in all 7 local authorities, and it had to be integrated into the regional travel app. So it enabled us to build a very localised system, a network of basically 7 mini schemes with a supply chain that we embedded in the region as well. So creating roles not just in our contract but also within our supply chain. There had previously been a first generation of the scheme that hadn't been able to launch, so the promises and commitments around the mobilisation were critical, and we were required to mobilise that scheme over about a 6-month period, which we were able to do by standing up a separate and dedicated mobilisation team that was able to manage the planning, the approvals, the communications in parallel with the operations team, who were launching and managing the schemes as each of the 7 authority schemes as they were launching. So we had like dual activity taking place at the same operating in parallel. Sorry. So on that note, if you just move to the final slide, I won't go through it, but yeah, there we go. It's just a final poll. If you could just populate your responses, which is, and the poll is, what do you see as being the biggest challenges to launching a micromobility service? Thank you.
Awesome, thank you very much. I'm sorry to push you at the end. Loads of really interesting content there, and kind of the golden future of a revenue surplus for a micromobility scheme that Liberatus kind of touched on is, I'm sure, landed with a lot of people. I'd like to get to the panel now, so we can get to the questions. The panel, yeah, speakers could join the panel, and Dan from Leicester is going to join as well. Dan, could we start with just a quick intro from you, please?
Yeah, of course, happy to. So morning, everyone. I'm Dan Pearman. I'm the City Transport Director with Leicester City Council. We did have a bike share scheme up until February of this year, when unfortunately the scheme went under. So yeah, I'm here to provide some local authority perspective from, unfortunately, what ended up being the whole life cycle of the scheme, rather than just a scheme in operation.
Brilliant, great to have you. Right, let's get to as many of these as we can. I'm going to start with questions that were pre-asked, and ones that pick up themes that we've already touched on. So Penelope from the City of Adelaide, exotically, has asked, how do authorities create more equitable micromobility schemes, including to consider gender? And I think we've heard already that there's a bias towards male use of e-scooters particularly. I wonder if Antonia might want to start with that. you picked up on this a little bit in your presentation. So equitable
Yeah,
schemes
sure.
and focus on gender.
Yeah, I mean, bike share is more equitable gender-wise than cycling is generally. Scooters is less even, but it's actually there's quite a variety across the schemes if you break them down. Some have done better than others. And I imagine that the main factor in that is infrastructure, so people feel safe and comfortable on the scooters, and the opportunity to have training and support to make that happen. And those things make a really big difference to making sure everybody's feeling included.
Thank you. Just to build on that, I think, Shafaq, in the DFT trial, I think there was some evidence that women use e-scooters as a safety mechanism, maybe when walking home late at night, are more likely to. Do you have any thoughts on gender and women's use of female use of scooters, e-scooters, and micromobility?
Yeah, Shafaq, I should, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Thank
you.
I have to be honest with you. I don't. It's not my sort of it's not the area of policy that I look after, so I don't have the sort of details. Obviously, I think ensuring that a successful scheme is an inclusive scheme is sort of like a key principle. I think it's a very fair question, and I think as I say, we are using the trials data to inform sort of what the framework would look like from our side. Certainly, I don't have, I think, any more sort of detailed analysis, unfortunately.
I could just come back on that point if that's useful, because I think that there are some questions in the chat about how much scooters are taking from walking trips, and actually sometimes if people do feel safer, as well as the journey being more enjoyable or faster, then I think that's a really important point. And I think we have to think again in terms of the safety issue about making sure that those designated parking spaces are in really nice, clearly well lit, visible places with lots of footfall where people feel really comfortable and safe to pick them up, rather than, you know, left to whatever space is available in dark corners.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, if I could just chime in quickly. So to pick up on Antonia's point about infrastructure, there are a number of studies out there that point to the fact that women are more likely to use sustainable transport, active transport modes, especially cycling, when there is dedicated cycling infrastructure. So I think that is also part of it. To Sam's point, you know, if the city is making wider investments in sustainable transport, we could probably see a little bit more gender parity. And then another one is actually down to the vehicle type and the vehicle choice. So there that we pointed to e-scooters, but also some of these other more adjacent modes. If we're looking at cargo bikes, those enable different types of trips. And I think they start to appeal to a slightly different user base potentially. Because if we're taking into account what it is that people are trying to, you know, commuter is only just one type of trip. Maybe you need to carry something. There are different things that people are trying to achieve whilst on these vehicles. So I think there is a little bit about the hardware selection as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for those responses. Let's move on to another question. This has come through from Rupert at Buckinghamshire, asking where e-scooters and e-bikes have been introduced in parallel. Where have these been most successful, and what can we do to ensure the success of both schemes? And I think the Serco colleagues talked a little bit about the kind of multimodal approach to micromobility. Who would like to take that one?
Sure, I can pick that up. So I think there are some examples around the UK of where e-scooters have launched, and then some e-bikes have launched as well and seem to be operating well. So I think there's an example in Liverpool with one of the Voice schemes where they introduced both, and I know that in Norwich as well there's been a really good there was a good presentation last year at the Active Travel conference where that scheme had observed where e-scooters and e-bikes and pedal bikes all on the same platform. They saw an improvement in all modes. Operating in two regions where they run in parallel but separate suppliers. It's difficult to draw, I think, a firm conclusion on the long-term viability of that because it's still quite new. I think it needs to link to that point around network and network density, which is the market size big enough for both modes effectively? And are there, if you've got your user persona as well through in the planning stage, is there a network that you can design where both modes can thrive? So are there particular areas where e-scooters are popular, or particular times where e-scooters are popular? And then equally, is there longer journeys where e-bikes are more appropriate and more widely used? So I think those are the key considerations.
Thank you. Dan, do you have any experience of those two modes in the scheme you mentioned? You're muted.
I should be back now, hopefully. It's a problem with two mute buttons. We didn't have any e-scooters, unfortunately, in the Leicester scheme, but we were asked to consider them at one point, and we did raise a concern about the possibility for conflicting modes of travel and usage. There's also just in general the fact that the e-bike solution that we offered was designed as a transitional period. It was designed to get people into private ownership of a cycle, whether that be an e-bike or whether a normal cycle, and we just couldn't see a position for e-scooters to go on that. It was always, say, a potential rather than anything realised.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question. So one of the popular questions asked today is about mode shift from walking and cycling to micromobility. What evidence do we have on that? Where are most new trips coming from? Antonia, you did talk about this, I think, briefly earlier. Do you want to pick that up first?
Yeah, I mean, I can put the link to the DFT evaluation in the chat in a second. Approximately half across all the trials of the trips came from walking. Then it was a kind of around 20% from car, and then about 10 or so from cycling, or less than that, and so forth. But I just don't think we should end up having kind of too much of a competition around this. I think people should have a choice of mode, and that's a really, a really good thing. It's whatever mode fits your need on that day, rather than us saying it's best to do this, and be prescriptive about it. I'll put the link in the chat in a sec.
Thank you. Great. Would anyone like to come in on that point?
I can just chip in with almost an anecdote, really, based on our findings. So the most common trips that we had under our scheme were under 100 metres, which, when we removed some statistical anomalies of people docking and undocking and not completing a trip, just suggested that there was a lot of travel around our dense urban core. For anyone that doesn't know Leicester, it's almost entirely pedestrianised in the city centre, so it's reasonable to assume that a lot of those journeys would have otherwise been walked. There was, however, one particular link between the station to the southwest of the city centre and the rail station, which was our absolute strongest. And we've not been able to find anything to prove otherwise, but our expectation is that that would have previously been a passenger transport journey just because of the distance. So the expectation is that majority of journeys and trips were translated from walking, but there was a considerable core of them that were otherwise translated from passenger transport. If the scheme had expanded into the outer areas of the city, then we did envisage a swap from the motor vehicle, but that's not something that we ever realised from the data.
Okay, thank you. And I think that brings to mind another popular question in the chat about safety. So a question from Paul Osborne about the safety of e-scooters. And I know it's always very well reported where there is an incident, but do people want to come in on the statistical kind of basis for any concerns around safety and how they relate to other modes?
I'm happy to kind of come in on that. I think there's a whole different aspects to safety, obviously. Most of the incidents that we've seen have been with private scooters rather than rental scooters, due to the nature of the fact that they can be adjusted and they're not regulated, hence the need for regulation. There was a very tight recording of incidents that have happened with rental scooters. It is a tiny fraction of the overall. There's been millions of trips being done. And I think you also have to put that in context of what's happened, what happens every day in terms of car accidents and accidents, involving pedestrians in cars and cyclists in cars and so forth. I think there's other aspects in terms of safety of using it in terms of making sure there's infrastructure there, and like I was saying about people feeling that they can come to bays with well lit and so forth as well, and the need for training and so forth there. So it's a whole package of things, and I think the operators have done a fantastic job because it's a trial and everybody's on show. They've put a lot of emphasis on this area. I guess the other aspect is people with visual impairments and the safety aspects of those and on the street, and there's things being done in terms of adding sounds and detectors, and making sure that that technology is used as well to make the use of the modes as safe as possible. But yeah, I think if we were to invent the car tomorrow, we would say, hold on, there's a few safety concerns here. So I think we shouldn't just dismiss this without looking at all the wider context.
From a Sustrans perspective, I think that's a perfect answer. Does anyone want to add any more to that?
I think, yeah, just for myself, I think I totally agree with the car argument, but there's a harsh reality to the fact that the cars aren't going to massively go away quickly, are they? This is a marathon, not a sprint, and I think there's a really interesting challenge for the industry. And I don't have like the specific answers at the moment, but at the moment, what has happened in the initial trial phase is the answer is often being rooted in technology. So you see significant technology improvements on the assets. So whether it's cameras, ride sensors, all these things that can improve the safety of the rider. But I think there are some considerations, I think, around how the infrastructure can develop, like the on-street infrastructure, maybe to like alleviate the parking concerns. Now the challenge there is that all these things just add cost into what is already a model that is generally the general trend on e-scooters specifically at the moment is these are operator funded. So all these things add cost into those operations, which ultimately could then be passed to the end user through higher tariffs, or could impact overall usage. So I think that's an interesting challenge that needs to be worked through over the next few years.
Excellent, thank you. Just looking around the room, I think we'll move on to the next question. So a popular one in the chat, and I'm sure it's in a lot of people's minds, is what are the government plans for dealing with, in inverted commas, private e-scooters? Legislation appears to focus on micromobility hire schemes and not dealing with current illegal use of private e-scooters. And this is something that I'm sure we pick up a lot in conversations. I could see you nodding there, Shafaq. Do you want to come in on that one? Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if I just work backwards, I think if it seems that the government focuses on the shared framework, that perhaps is a slight miscommunication, in that the framework, I think, in our minds probably is rather an aspect of a larger sort of, not a larger legislation, but that there is a piece on e-scooter regulation that needs to happen, private e-scooter use, specifically noting that sort of they've entered the market into a bit of a gap. At the minute we've got plans that we will be introducing a new vehicle classification that e-scooters would fall into when parliamentary time does allow us to do that. So that would be the low speed zero emission vehicle classification, of which e-scooters would be the first. We're hoping that e-scooters will be the first to be classified within that. And also that vehicle classification is being created to ensure that we don't fall into this situation again, where a sort of new technology enters the market and we don't really know what to do with it, and then we have to sort of rely on, government processes, or government just mechanisms, parliamentary mechanisms, to make sure that we get the correct regulations in place. So I don't think if it seems like that, that's unfortunate, because I don't think that's accurate. It is something that we're looking into quite extensively to make sure that we fall on the right side of what those regulations should be, and that there's sufficient regulation. I will point out that I mentioned about the consultation later on in the year about what we might want to do for a shared framework. There will be a separate consultation earlier than that about what we might want e-scooter regulations to be, and that would relate to private e-scooter use as well. Okay, so towards the back end of this year, did you say on that one? That would be for the shared one. I think the private one will be probably earlier than that. So I want to say about summertime. Again, we don't have like a precise sort of launch date.
Okay, there'll be
Yeah.
a lot of interest in that. Thank you. Thanks very much. I guess that's a very specific question, so we'll probably move on to another. There's quite a lot of interest in scale of how, you know, where micromobility works. And Neil from Work from Hub is asking what factors are need to be considered for having micromobility schemes on a regional basis across a number of different local authorities. Clearly, people not being bothered about local authority boundaries. So what do we need to think about when we go at scale with this? I think maybe we start here with our colleagues from Serco who did touch on this a little bit.
Do you want me to go, Liberatus, or do you want to?
I think you start and I'll chime in at the end.
Yeah, so we have some experience in this, obviously, with the West Midlands scheme, which, like I say, is across 7 authority areas. And I think for if looking at like a large geographical area, I think the point that Antonia raised earlier is really pertinent, which is around, like, actually the majority of micromobility trips are very short. So I would always be looking at the networks that you can build out, which I think Liberatus touched on. So across a region, are there 6 or 7 or whatever the number is, hubs of activity where you can see lots of short journeys taking place? So I think, like, the data supports that is where the journeys are going to come from, and especially if it's if you're going to rely on tariffs to support most of the cost of that, then you need to start there. I think there are really interesting opportunities, but I think that it's fair to say they are emerging around, like, e-vehicles, e-cargos that may be able to support longer forms of mode shift, and you've even got things like we're not working with these at the moment, but I think there's some operators in London like e-scooter hire, which obviously, like, lends itself to much longer journeys, but I think those are really unproven and would only be done on a small scale. So yeah, irrespective of whether it's irrespective of, like, the region size, I think it's drilling in on those specific areas of where you'll expect to see activity, and that has to be driven by network density. So what's the population density in those areas?
Thank you.
If I just add to that quickly, I think Antonia touched on something very interesting in her presentation when she spoke about long-term hire or medium-term hire and kind of back-to-base models. That's something that we haven't seen as much in the UK from an authority perspective, but especially if we call out the French market, I think we've seen some really good schemes over there. So you've got the Belligo scheme, which covers kind of like the Greater Paris area. That's up to 20,000 vehicles, and they've got different asset types within that. But it's not exclusively for really large authorities. Even smaller places like Grenoble and a number of smaller authorities, they've had quite a good amount of success with that. So that's definitely something that authorities could look into. And then similarly, on a more regional basis, I think, Shafaq, you had something in your presentation a little bit around devolution. And what we've seen is there's a couple of smaller authorities that are quite interesting. You know, if they are able to set up a metro mayor system, then actually could they all come together and start to apply for a regional scheme, maybe somewhat similar in design to that of the West Midlands. And again, I think the West Midlands is really forward thinking in that within the UK. But if we look at the continent, there are some good examples there. For example, Radiorad in Stuttgart, that's another scheme which kind of goes around the main Stuttgart city centre, but that's a scheme of little towns and conurbations that have come together, and users are able to use bikes across those. So I think there is a lot of learning that can be done from other places as well that we can bring to the UK to see how we can better suit the needs of smaller authorities.
Yeah, that Stuttgart example sounds fascinating. Sorry.
If I could just quickly come in, thank you, Liberatus. I think what you referred to there is sort of a, you know, if we sort of keep in mind sort of the bigger picture that's happening in sort of other areas, you know, there is changes being made to local devolution structures. And I think one of the things, and this is why I flagged it as a risk as well in that slide, is that we want to make sure that anything that we're thinking of right now and that we're developing is something that can take into account and be flexible to changes in local devolution structure. So there is moves towards creating more combined authorities, and obviously, you know, there are plans in place for some of those changes are sort of closer in the future. But I think that's seems to be, at least from my perspective, it seems as though that's sort of where we're moving towards. And also that I do think that that's one of the key things that we want to make sure as well, is that we don't want this to be a mode that's only available in large metropolitan areas. Of course, you know, we've seen a lot of success in those areas for obvious reasons, but I think also and I would really be interested in some of those case studies that you've just mentioned, because certainly, like from my perspective, I think there's a real opportunity in less metropolitan areas for modes that, you know, where there is unnecessarily heavy reliance, I suppose, on private vehicles, where there doesn't need to be necessarily. And I think there's an opportunity there for the mode, and that's certainly something, like I say, that we're thinking about, so that we can create something that it doesn't matter how large of an authority you are, it's easy enough to use, so that you might be able to establish a scheme for yourself, regardless of the size of your sort of, you know, area or yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a lot of interest in this topic, building on what the three of you just said. So I'm going to go to a question here. So how can outer city areas attract shared mobility unless this is incorporated into MOU that covers entire cities? Do people have views on that, outer cities and micro-mobility? I know bike share, I live in outer London, it failed when it was launched in my borough, but very successful in inner London. Who would like to pick up that? And Antonia, do you have a view on that one?
I think you really have to tailor it to the local needs. So I think it's interesting looking, there's a satellite town to Norwich and Wyndham, where they've actually successfully set up a connected element to the scheme there, but because it's got really good infrastructure, it's got really good traffic between those two locations, and it's got funding to link the two, and so there's just a really good purpose around it. Whereas other market towns, I think, that have got a similar nature, you know, are not going to be so successful with an on-street self-service model. And I do think, you know, it's really valuable to kind of look at all these different leasing models, long-term loans, community-led. We've got a whole load of case studies on our website about community-led schemes, where you're encouraging people to do short or longer hires, and there's a lot of you know, value in embedding it into other activities that are happening in communities. So you know, it can work in outside of cities. It can work in many kind of larger towns, but I think you've got to fit it to, you know, where's the trip generators. You know, perhaps it's a shuttle service that you're going to develop between a business park or university and a rail station, but make sure that there's a real definite need there, rather than just saying we want a bike share or scooter share for the sake of it.
Yeah, interesting. Another good example to look at. Thank you. Sam, are you coming in?
Yeah. Just to add to that and the previous question, so I think in Europe they're probably doing this better than we are at the moment, and there's definitely some learnings from that. And I saw in the comments someone put a link to Swap Fiats in, which is obviously a really good scheme in London, where you can do a long-term e-bike rental for a monthly period. And I think that long-term e-bike rentals, I think, are a really interesting and potentially game-changing thing, because there's definitely a use case there. People definitely like e-bikes, and they're generally expensive to buy. The higher concept, I think, really works on a long-term basis. What I think Steve put in the comments is quite right. In France, a lot of those things are subsidised. So in the UK model at the moment, I think it's unlikely you're going to get many private long-term e-bike rentals popping up outside of cities, because I just don't, the market might not be there. And I think we'd need to see probably the model shift a little bit to be applicable. So the Veligo system in Paris is a great example, but again, like the French government are subsidising that. The outcomes they're achieving, though, for what is probably a relatively small subsidy, are pretty incredible. Like the mode shift in France, especially in Paris, has been unbelievable. Same with the Velib as well. Like the cost to hire an e-bike there is really, really competitive. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. Just jumping back to Antonia's point, I'd add one other thing. I completely agree with what Antonia said. The other way you might be able to get schemes to regions is if you can make a big enough procurement by partnering with other regions. So if you have a number of towns that are within a reasonable area, you might be able to work together to have a large procurement across multiple areas that you can then push out, and an operator may be able to deliver that. Market testing is a way to find that out, I think. And then equally, I think there are some cases where some providers in the market like franchise out their kit. So if you've got a social enterprise in the area, again, that and it's like a small market town, that might be an opportunity to explore as well.
Yeah, really interesting answer. Thinking about what the end objectives of the scheme are and how government can get behind that and different mechanisms to finance that. And imagination on that is really interesting. So we've been quite optimistic. Let's go right down. There's a question here from Brendan. What are the main reasons that schemes fail? And Dan, given your introduction, this has to come to you, I think. Main reasons schemes fail.
The principal reason for us is that investment funding didn't materialise for the operator. It was purely because of contractual relationships between them and a third party. So the scheme itself was progressing. That said, there were a few issues along the line, which I think is fair to say could impact the scheme. There were a number of bouts of vandalism that led to, one, a loss of public interest in the scheme. It's broken window effect. If you've got a series of docking stations that are damaged, or the only thing you see from a bike is it's floating in the River Sar, you're not really going to be inclined to use the scheme. We also, in general, there was a need for constant growth of the scheme, and that was stunted by that lack of investment in the operator. It's ultimately, a scheme like this needs to expand until it covers the whole area. We started with a very good core of stations. We had the next 2 phases planned in. We'd actually gone beyond what we intended. We originally intended a 50 station scheme, and we'd ended up planning for 53. So we had a very large scheme planned, but we ended up stalling around the mid-30s mark just because of that lack of investment funding. So it needs to expand, it needs to be properly resourced, and it also needs to be managed correctly, just to make sure that it's always available when people need it, it's always in a good working condition, and it doesn't seem like it's a hub or attractor for any kind of vandalism or antisocial behaviour.
So is that difficult experience had any knock-on effects to your wider efforts on sustainable travel and moving away from the car?
I don't think necessarily it has. The main difficulty we've run into is that, given where we are in the election cycle, we've not been able to go to either the elected city mayor or to our administration and say, what is the appetite for us to either re-procure a scheme or to go back to basics and see what the next stages are. Well, we're still looking at delivering infrastructure. We're still looking at delivering transitional methods. One thing to mention as well is that we've actually got a series of longer term rentals that we're pursuing at the moment. We've got a series of folding bikes that we're offering to people in employment or people on relatively low wage brackets or demographics, recognising that it's hard to store a full-size bicycle. We're working in partnership with Cycling UK and others for Wheels to Work and the e-cycle funding. So we've got a number of options that we're trying to almost plug the interim gap with, and then we'll take a look and see. We know we need to get people moving around. We know that actual bike ownership, certainly among children in Leicester, is incredibly poor. What solution allows us to give people access to a cycle, and what allows them to make those type of journeys as well? So it's probably fair to say that we've not gone all the way back, but we're taking a few steps to reassess what data and what we've learned to make sure that we're doing something that's correct for what our ambitions are.
Right, really interesting. Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on why schemes fail? Really big question.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I completely sort of mirror some of the things that Daniel just said. Vandalism is a big one, and I think linking it back to that, when schemes are being planned, the risk on vandalism is an important point. Again, irrespective of model, whether you want operator to run it or whatever, I think that vandalism piece is important, because ultimately, if an operator is taking full risk on vandalism and it is a scheme that is being heavily vandalised, it can make it pretty untenable to continue if you're a commercial business. I think other than that, I think there's a lot to be said, I think, for the structure of the contracts, so being flexible. So I think I mentioned in the previous slide that long-term contracts are good, it enables the operator to invest in them, but the flexibility around the contracts and how they can be adjusted as time goes on in favour of both parties, I think, is something that is important for an industry that's quite new. It can be quite risky if you're going to try and have quite a rigid contracting structure rather than something that is, yeah, quite a new industry, I think.
Thank you. Anyone else on that one? Schemes fail?
I think I would just kind of refer you to the opposite of my 4 points earlier in the presentation. Really, like if you get all those right, then you're probably going to do okay. Funding does tend to be kind of a dominant issue, and you have to think about that long term in terms of bikes being replaced and you know, various iterations and development of a scheme. That it has been the kind of probably number one issue with criminal damage coming after that. So I posted in the chat about ways to try and mitigate against the criminal damage side of things as well. But yeah, there's been, you know, it is about kind of having a concerted effort for the scheme, not just putting it in and not integrating it into policies, not looking after it. It's got to be a long-term investment.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. As you'd imagine, a lot of interest in funding, and maybe the question in the chat from Matthew Cotton sums this up. So what advice would you give for local authorities who want to get a micro-mobility scheme off the ground, but are limited in funding, both capital and revenue? Where could you get this funding from? And it seems right to go back to Liberatus and Sam, because I think you talked on about various funding models, but yeah, maybe you can add to that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Liberatus, do you want to go?
Yeah, so as we said, engaging with sponsors or potential sponsor partners early, that's definitely one way that people can look at it. There are a number of nascent sources. So we talked about Section 106 funding and community infrastructure levies. Again, these are things that are more broad, but I believe there are a number of opportunities out there which may not be earmarked necessarily as cycle hire funding or cycle funding. However, if authorities put together a program and then submit an application specifically for bike share or micromobility more generally, they could be able to kind of align that funding to get the scheme started. And then, so potentially, if there's not funding available at the outset from either the local authority or potentially grant funding as well, or even sponsors, then, but if they're able to get off the ground using some funding grants, then potentially they'll be able to use their own funding and sponsorship to bolster the scheme at a later date. So to Sam's point, kind of to do that user growth perspective, because if they've got a little bit of a proof of concept, they'll then be able to boost it, get some more longevity out of it.
If I could add one other thing to that, I think, and if funding is an issue, there are other ways that authorities can support delivery. So, for instance, if they have premises that the operators can operate out of, for instance, things like that that can enable them to operate at a lower cost base is another way in which an operator can be supported if there isn't actually like capital funding or grant funding available to support asset purchase or revenue or operational delivery.
I would just add, just be realistic. If people are promising you too much for too little money, be careful of that. If it looks too good to be true, focus on specific areas. Some schemes have launched just focusing on university and business park areas, and that's a really good way to start, and you can then build on that in future years. But yeah, be realistic.
Can I just add from my side as well? We had a large capital injection via the Transforming Cities Fund, which paid for a lot of the initial bikes and docks. But the principal thing we found out is that our procurement was so restricted that we weren't able to actually invest money in the scheme moving forward. So one thing to bear in mind, that even if the money's there needs to be a pathway to get into the scheme if ever necessary.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Really good answers. Thanks very much. I think there's a Homes England colleague on the call. It'd be interesting if the travel planning for new developments can include a micro-mobility offer. Anyway, that's the end. We're at time. Thank you very much. I want to thank our speakers for their time and expertise. It's a really interesting subject. I think you've all learned an awful lot from the speakers today. And I think, you know, that the positivity around this space in here is really great. And clearly, micro-mobility is here to stay. Thank you for Landor for organising, and for Serco for sponsoring. And I think we're at time. Thank you all very much, and thanks for keeping to time. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all.